Good morning. Welcome to the Phoebe Cook Lecture Series. We want to thank Phoebe Muzzy and friends of the family for their generosity in supporting the Phoebe Cook Lecture Series and make it available for us to have wonderful, incredible speakers every year. So we thank you so much for coming. I also want to thank and we also want to thank Dale Skaggs, who has worked very hard, and Elizabeth Dickinson in making all of this possible for us today. Again, we thank you so much for coming out today. Before I leave the podium, I just want to say there's a little card in your chair, and we are having Kathy B. Graham with a C. She is a author, a floral designer. She's adorable. Look her up on Instagram. We are having her come to Memphis March the 2nd at the Memphis Botanic Gardens. So we would love for you to come. So please take the postcard, and we'll be doing other advertisements too. And we would love for you to be there. I'll turn it over to Dave. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. Hello, everybody. I'm Dale Skaggs, Director of Horticulture for the Dixon Gallery and Gardens, and I will welcome you all to the Dixon for our 34th annual Phoebe Cook Lecture. This lecture series was established by the late Phoebe Cook Welch in honor of her mother, Phoebe Cook, and members of her family and friends have continued to generously support the original endowment. I would also like to thank Phoebe Muzzy. Another shout out to Phoebe. Would you stand, Phoebe, and let's give you a round of applause. She's a member of the Cook family, and she came in from Houston to attend this lecture, so we're grateful for all she does for the Dixon. I also want to thank the Memphis Garden Club, of which Pam Martin, you just heard from, is the president. They play an active role at the Dixon and have been associated with this lecture series since its inception. The Dixon has a close working relationship with the Memphis Garden Club, and we look forward to continuing and strengthening this relationship in the future. So I'll get straight to the purpose of this lecture series. It's to bring world-class speakers with cutting-edge ideas to the Mid-South in the areas of horticulture, ecology, and floral design. And over the years, this series has been immensely successful at raising the awareness of horticulture and floral design in the Mid-South. The list of speakers over the past 3 decades is filled with landscape architects, writers, photographers, ecologists from around the country, England, Italy, Belgium. We intend to continue this tradition of excellence in speakers in the years to come. So I'm really glad that you have come today to take advantage of this free lecture. Of all the lectures we've had over 3 decades, like I mentioned, today's speaker brings an especially timely and relevant message to the Mid-South. The Dixon is about to wrap up the first year of a 5-year strategic plan. And on the garden side, one of the major objectives is to focus on our living collections in a scholarly way. And hopefully this lecture will enlighten us on the significance of these efforts. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce our 2022 Phoebe Cook lecturer, Dr. Richard Olsen. Dr. Olsen is the director of the National Arboretum in Washington, D.C. He's had an amazing list of inspiring mentors. They're really horticultural icons. The great J.C. Ralston, Dan Hinckley, Dr. Michael Durr, and they've helped sort of guide him to where he is today. The institution he works for was founded in 1927 under the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It's located on 541 acres in northwest Washington, D.C. It conducts research that benefits both American growers and consumers, and its collections house specimens for scientists to conduct research in fields like botany, horticulture, and medicine. Dr. Olsen holds 3 degrees in landscape design and horticultural science. After finishing his doctoral degree in North Carolina State University, Dr. Olsen started working for the Arboretum as a geneticist. In 2010, he headed the Arboretum's germplasm program, which strives to maximize genetic resources conservation. Following his stint as acting director, which he was appointed to in 2014, he was officially appointed the director of the Arboretum in 2015. He has published and co-authored hundreds of scientific peer-reviewed papers. Dr. Olsen has championed sustainability throughout his career, from researching trees that are resistant to climate change and disease to reimagining the future of the Arboretum. We are all in for a treat. Thank you for being here this morning, and now I give you Dr. Richard Olsen.
Thank you, Dale. Thank you. Yeah, then we turned that one off. And maybe it won't matter.
It looks like an on-off switch.
Oh, there we go. We just go like this?
You're good.
All right. Well, you know, I hope you guys are ready for a whole lot of conversation about plants, which hopefully going to lead to a whole lot more action in the garden, if you know what I mean, baby. If you know what I mean. So you can blame Elizabeth for that, but I will stick to my day job. But wow, what a great town, what a great reception. My last experience with Memphis was simply barbecue bologna in the airport, so this is far better so far. And so, you know, welcome, or thank you for having me. And this is indeed a great pleasure to get out of the red tape and bureaucracy of Washington, D.C. for a little bit. I used to travel a lot for lectures and presentations, and then COVID really sort of shut us down like everyone. I was getting really tired of virtual presentations and staff meetings when people's cameras are off and no one's paying attention. So it's nice to see live faces again. And as Dale said, you know, United States National Arboretum, I have to sort of put a plug, but it's not specifically so much about us today, although I will use a lot of references to what we do. But really, this notion of that, for me, it sort of almost comes up with art for art's sake or plants for plant's sake, is there's the role of plants in our landscapes from an aesthetic component is not mutually exclusive from their botanical value or their other value. So there are layers in our collections just like in an art museum, and the more you understand those layers, you document those layers, the more you can use those in your interpretation, your outreach, your connections, and hopefully you know, relay more to whoever your stakeholders and audiences are. And so it's really important to sort of think that for plants, they're the medium of the art of our landscapes. And while you can't sort of remove often the didactic or utilitarian nature of plants, the landscapes themselves are art, but also the plants, to me, are certainly art. And so it's really about these layers and opportunities for interpretation, what we do, and maybe how they can relate to elevate all of the gardens in the United States in terms of understanding the current need and value for the information and the plants that we carry in our gardens. So that's sort of the premise of today's talk. And I thought I'd add this in here for Phoebe. This is the eponymous genus for the Phoebes of the world. And I think it's really interesting. I coined this common term, by the way, brilliant laurel, because Greek Phoebe means brilliant or bright, and was the Titan goddess of bright intellect. So I think that probably applies for the Phoebes here and past. So, but it is a genus of plants. It's probably not going to be something that works here, but maybe down in Houston if you can get this. This is a beautiful, brilliant laurel from Zhejiang, China. And incredible foliage, and speaks to a little bit about some of the layers as well. This is a vulnerable species in China, and so there's a need to conserve that, not just be a beautiful plant. And so if you're familiar with sassafras or any of the perseas or anything in the Lauraceae, the linden family or Lindera family, spicebush family, you'll recognize the fruit. Avocado is in that family. But I also want to say that not just to to butter up Phoebe and everyone else, but is because of the role of garden clubs of America has played actually in the formation of the United States National Arboretum. Not many people maybe know this, but when the idea of forming the National Arboretum came about the turn of the century, and yes, it's government, so it took 20 years to figure out how to do it, but it was really led by Mrs. Frank B. Noyes, or Janet Noyes, of the Garden Club of America. Now, she was DC based, and then there was the New York headquarters, and so if you've ever read the book on the history, it's fascinating, the tug of war between New York and Washington. But anyways, we were created in 1927, and it was to really, because Mrs. Frank B. Noyes put us over the top and demanded that there be a National Arboretum to the White House. So, and so this is taken from the book. I'm sure many of you in the celebration of the history of the Garden Clubs of America are familiar with it. So that's actually, we named an azalea after her. We are known for our azaleas, the Glendale azaleas in Washington, D.C., bred by our first director. And so this was actually named after her in her honor. So it's a wonderful azalea. The other thing that was interesting with the Garden Club of America at the time, and not many people know this, but in the 1920s, 1930s, American holly, good old American holly, was actually in the mid-Atlantic states being over-harvested and threatened for two industries, Christmas greens and then landscapes. And so there was actually, it's hard to believe in the 1930s, we were not growing a lot of American holly in the nursery industry. So the Garden Club of America said, well, you need to do something about this. So one of our first research projects at the National Arboretum was to focus on hollies, all of the American hollies, and identifying clones that would be better for the nursery industry and serving as a reference collection. And so to this day, you can see, I put this long quote in the bottom, but that's just part of what we do is we document and make this available to the industry. And so we published a checklist of American holly cultivars. There's several hundred, almost 1,000. And so we sort of sorted through the morass. And this is an old cultivar you rarely see anymore called Halcyon. So thank you to the Garden Club of America. We focused on hollies in the 1920s and 1930s. And so at the National Arboretum, it sort of represents what we do in a nutshell. So we have an incredible holly collection. It's part of the official arboretum for the Holly Society of America. We have 403 accessions. So that's like an accessioned artwork. 42 species represented. So not all accessions are, the same species. 258 clones, cultivars, varieties in that collection. We've introduced more than 35 hollies to the United States nursery industry over the past 8 decades. We've published 2 international checklists on hollies. We've recently published the Flora of North America treatment on hollies, and then the official Holly Arboretum, and we work with the Holly Society of America. So it touches on everything we do, from being a collection that is a reference collection for the industry, for local gardeners, a resource to come in and see which hollies are best. Then we use those by our scientists to breed new and better hollies. We use the taxonomists to understand what it is we actually have, what's missing, where we should go in the world to collect new hollies. And then we publish all of that. So it connects all of the dots that we do at the National Arboretum as part of the Agricultural Research Service. So we are unique in the sense that we have a $14 million budget, and it's primarily for research and science. That's a really good start to a budget for everything else, which I wish we had, but we are first and foremost a research-based, collections-based scientific institution. So here we come back again to the Garden Club of America circle in the National Arboretum. So we're not just a scientific collection row upon row upon row of plants. That would be pretty boring, but scientists do like that. It's pretty efficient. But this is everything I've talked about is encapsulated in that garden. Now you can enjoy that at one level, and most of our visitors do. It's a beautiful spot. Or you can delve deeper. So this was the Garden Club of America circle, and they donated after the war. We had a little problem with the Depression in World War II. So once that was over, we started to hit high gear at the National Arboretum and in the United States in general, the post-World War II, 1950s boom, right? So the Garden Club of America donated over 100 Camellia japonica, Japanese camellias, and likewise Sasanquil camellias, which formed the start of our collection. So it's a beautiful partnership. We didn't have to go buy those plants. We got them donated by our friends and stakeholders. And then if you're interested in more information here, like that's a Perry Wheeler landscape. So some gardens collect landscapes. Longwood Gardens is doing that right now. They're going, just like you collect designers or whatnot, they're collecting designer landscapes, right? So you may be interested in doing that. But it also has some of the rarest trees in North America in this collection. So, and for me, if you haven't figured it out by now, I'm a plant geek and I love plants. And diversity of plants is really the leitmotif of what sort of binds our gardens together. It's the diversity of plants. And it occurs throughout, and if you do it really well, like this, which is our Asian Valley, which is downhill from the Garden Club of America circle, you can enjoy that, again, at the purely aesthetic level, or you can really geek out and figure out what is there. But they're not mutually exclusive. You can do both, and all it takes is labels and records. And then it takes interpretation. You have to invest in interpretation and outreach and education. So again, no matter how your plants are used, whether simply repeat it like here, these giant arborvitae, a pleached hedge, you have a wonderful pleached hedge, a hornbeam out front. This is at the memorial for fallen law enforcement officers in Washington, D.C. There's a brilliant hedge, a pleached hedge of linden, Tilia cordata. Or where I interned, you put it all together, and this is a Heronswood garden in Seattle, Dan Hinckley's garden, where he took and created something a little bit more fantastical, but also that garden has some of the rarest and coolest plants that have been ever introduced to North America. So again, not mutually exclusive. It comes back to how you understand and what you want to invest in. And so some of the smallest gardens in the world do this really well. How many people recognize this? This is Sissinghurst, the famous Sissinghurst garden in the White Garden, a view from the castle or the tower. So again, 8 acres, but it's one of the most important gardens in the history of gardens, Western gardens. So I've already said this is what we do. I have to do this because we're being filmed, and in case anyone from Congress or USDA or my bosses, this is the Kool-Aid part. I drank it, federally funded. And I don't mean to be trite, it's very important because we view what we do to solve problems for American agriculture, specifically ornamental landscape, nursery, greenhouse. That's what we're doing. We're solving problems to enable them and in transferring that technology so we can improve basically the American economy. That is why we exist. And that is not probably why Dixon exists or why Memphis exists or a lot of others. In fact, we're pretty unique in that regard, but it's a really important part of what we do. And so we have a nice legacy, and I put this in here because this is important. This is David Fairchild, the gentleman with the white hair on the left, receiving the Frank N. Meyer Award for his role in plant exploration and collection in the United States. And he's receiving it from Henry Wallace, who at the time was the Secretary of Agriculture, but then became vice president one of the vice presidents under FDR. If you really want to get into it, he's also considered one of the worst vice presidents ever. Anyways, you can look into it. So, but it was back in the day where you didn't really have control over your vice presidents like we do now, apparently. So anyways, David Fairchild established the Plant Exploration Bureau for the United States in the 1890s. And so he sent collectors around the world saying, there's this amazing diversity of not only food crops, but flower crops. You know, if you looked at a dinner plate at the turn of the century, it was gray, overcooked, starchy vegetables. Green vegetables had the chlorophyll leached out of them. You had gray, overcooked meat. We didn't know how to cook even food back then, right? And so here's this diversity of food crops and other things that we should be eating, and of course ornamentals as well. So I think he's basically the godfather of the National Arboretum. I always like to tell, this is him sitting at the desk on the left, and on the right is the famous plant explorer Frank N. Meyer. If you've ever heard of Meyer lemon, this is the gentleman that brought it back from China along with thousands of other crops. And so that is his desk, and that's my desk at the National Arboretum. So I have inherited this legacy for the National Arboretum to continue this notion of promoting and bringing in new plants, evaluating great plants. And so this is a quote from David Fairchild. So Frank Meyer is a hero of mine. Unfortunately, he died mysteriously on the Yangtze River on one of his collection trips around World War I. But he introduced this plant from China. It's actually reintroduced it. So this is the lace bark pine. This is Pinus bungiana. You can get this in the trade. It should do very well here. There's one in the Dixon garden, a young plant. But give it 500 years and it may look like this. You might want to create more space. But that is not, it's a black and white photo, but that is its bark. It's as white as a sycamore. And it's a very well, it's been cultivated for a long time in China, introduced in the 1850s via England, subsequently sort of lost and not really well known until Frank Meyer reintroduced it. And so the tree on the left is how you see it growing in Beijing. The tree in the middle represents diversity, so this is why we collect seeds. Which one would you want in your garden of the two? The one that has the muted gray-brown bark, or the one with a silver bark? Well, the silver bark was grown from seed and has now received the name Silver Ghost. That's from the Dawes Arboretum from a collection. And then the one on the right is one called Great Wall. That's from one of the greatest nurserymen that ever lived in the United States. He's still alive. Don Shadow of Winchester, Tennessee, named that plant that's grown in his garden. So this is what we do. We find these plants, and it takes a long time and a lot of proselytizing to get some of these to pick up, but it's worth it. And then all of that is for naught because you don't have to enjoy it at that level, right? You can do both. So this is our old tree at the National Arboretum, and this is the second gentleman, Doug Imhoff, who came specifically to the Arboretum because he cares about green space, accessibility, and equitable access. And he came to Arbor Day, and so I got to tour him around. He really walks the walk and loves trees and loves plants. And so, again, he didn't really care that the taxonomic history of this tree, but you can't help but be overwhelmed by the beauty of that tree. So again, it's not mutually exclusive. You can do both. And like I said, it takes a long time, and this is the role of gardens, to sometimes get good plants in. And fashions and fads change. And so this is Shantung maple, collected by Frank Meyer, as I mentioned before. On the left, that's the original photo from China. Those are seedlings off of those trees growing at the National Arboretum. And on the right is trees that you see in Beijing, which is, not many people realize that Beijing is the same parallel as Philadelphia. It's 40, right there is the 40 degree latitude mark. So collected over 100 years ago and sort of languished. No one really cared about it because you had Norway maples, sugar maples, all this other stuff. Well, this is the original tree actually growing at the Morris Arboretum from Meyer. And what happened was, flash forward into the late 1990s, and now people are starting to say, you know what? Norway maple's kind of invasive. And Norway maple doesn't like the heat. But you know what? The South has really developed in the last 40 years, and that's where horticulture is happening. So we need something that grows in the South. Well, lo and behold, you go back and you say, well, what about this tree that we've been growing for 100 years and no one cares about? Well, it's a close relative of Norway maple. And so now you see, finally, after 100 years, some market penetrance. You see cultivars being selected. The one on the left is Fire Dragon from down in Texas, Keith Johansson. The one in the middle is outrageously cool called Main Street from Mark Worthington Farms in North Carolina in the foliage. And now it's being used in breeding programs because they say, you know what? Norway maple stinks. It's invasive. But let's create something better. And so that would not have been capable or possible had somebody not preserved it. Preserve the lineage, preserve the names, and then make it available. So it's a long-term investment, and we take that to heart. And again, we're collections-based research. But most gardens are collections-based. You have plants. Hopefully not just hardscape, but you actually have plants. And so that's our maple collection. 90% of our visitors go through there and probably don't read a label. That's not unusual for us, and that's, I would dare say, for the Dixon, it's probably pretty close. Because if you look at visitor services and you look how people engage in museum, only about 5 to 10% of the people that come are the experts. How many of the visitors to Dixon are the art curators, artists, and professional artists versus the families, the multi-generational families, the children, right? So you're fulfilling multiple roles, and you don't just have to reach to the experts, you have to reach to everyone. But you can do it at the same time, and it just depends on what side of the mouth you talk out of. I'm from DC, I learned that. You have to talk out of both sides of your mouth. So this is our collection, it's not mutually exclusive. So here we are. Here's your one shot, Kevin, and the artist, sorry, maybe there's two in here. So I had the pleasure, DC is a fun place to be, and there was an exhibit coming through, and when I grew up, my father-in-law, wasn't my father-in-law at the time, but he's known me since I was a child, they had the Seasons by Archambault in their not the real ones, darn it, but they had prints in their kitchen. So it's autumn, and thank you to Heather and Elizabeth for that display out front with all the autumn leaves. It's outrageously cool, sort of. You even got the hops in there, which is great. So there was a exhibit in DC where they built 3D sculptures, and you got to tour these. It was a decade ago now, but this is the same thing with plants, right? That painting has layers of collection data. It has the artist, it has the period, the Renaissance, style, surrealism, mannerism, media, paintings, printings, and then input, whether it was oil or whatnot, subject, nature studies, allegory, and then the donor and patron. All of that is stuff that you use when you put together an exhibit, when you tell a story, a compelling story of why this art matters. It is no different with plants. It is there and available. So this is a boring label. This is our accession label. This is not the display label, but I only show this really because it's the oldest plant on the grounds, 1938. It's called the Longstalk holly, but we'll skip it. And it was from Glendale, Maryland, the plant introduction station where Frank Meyer was sending plants and David Fairchild was distributing around the country. And this is the old Glendale Research Station in Maryland, not far from where I live. And so this is Chinese Zelkova. So the average visitor just reads Chinese Zelkova. They're like, great, well, I recognize the common name, but the genus don't speak Latin, I don't understand it, right? So it's in the Olmesi. It has incredible layers and stories you can tell. So it's a PI, which means it was introduced. We know when it was introduced. It was from Nanjing, China, Sun Yat-sen Tomb in Memorial Park. It happens to be the first one ever grown in the United States, introduced in 1934, still alive. It has been used by scientists in taxonomy studies, elm leaf beetles studies. It has been highlighted in New Trees by John Grimshaw, who's the International Dendrology Society, and it represents Glendale. All of that is stuff that we can talk about. Now, does that resonate with the average visitor? No. But to the right audience at the right time, this is information that can be very useful. Again, to sit there and say, this is the first ever introduced. It actually wasn't the first introduced in the United States. It was the first introduced outside of China. And we had a role in it. It also has spectacular fall color. I don't know if you have room for any of this here, but certainly at Memphis across the street, amazingly cool plant for the future, Zelkova snyderiana. Actually, I think when we were botanizing yesterday, I think you may actually have one. So now the closest thing we have to real art at the Arboretum, we have a couple things, is our bonsai. And it's a pretty unique story, but don't have too much time to go into it, but we treat this the same way. So this is the Yamaki pine. And if you just go in and say, wow, that's a cool tree. Well, when you put the label on it and it says, in training since 1625, that gives you a little bit new perspective. That means that thing's been watered for 400 years, almost. Now, if I tell you the Yamaki was a nursery in Hiroshima and this tree survived the atomic blast by the safety of a garden wall, and that it was donated to the United States by the people of Japan as a peace tree, there's a new story. So is it just bonsai, or is there this compelling stories that you can do both? And then we do this in a display setting that encapsulates really cool plants. So why go to the store and get the same old plants that you've used in your landscape or that everyone has? It's like an art museum. You're not going to Walmart to buy a print. You're going to get the real deal. So that's what we do. We strive to go around the country and the world to get the real deal so that our plants, it's a reference collection. So this is Betty Tom wisteria. It was a new introduction from 2007 from Greenleaf. We got it from Greenleaf, the best provenance. We didn't get it from Kmart or Walmart. Nothing wrong with buying plants from there for your gardens. But for the Arboretum, we got to get to the source. We go and get it to make sure we have the real thing. And in the background is just blood good Japanese maple, industry standard. But if there's ever any confusion, we get to go back and say, we got the real deal. So again, it's important. So in 7 years of being the director, I've never once had the White House call and say, Richard, I really want to hear more about your oak collection. But you do get this. Is there anything wrong with this? Absolutely not. So I don't need to tell you who that is probably. That's First Lady Melania Trump with Prime Minister Abe's wife. And so a very important diplomatic meeting during the Trump administration with Abe. You know, Japan is a very important partners. And so on this trip, this is an official spousal visit. They went to 3 places that day. The vice president's residence, actually is where they started, the naval. They went to the White House, they went to the Washington Monument, and they came to the National Arboretum to see this. So you have to maximize that story. So here we are. We've heard the word germplasm. We've heard plant seed introductions. This is it, right in our hands. We're at this moment in the 21st century. These happen to be pretty cool plants, and I'll talk about this in a second. But what is germplasm? Why do we talk about it? But this is one of the only data or science sides today, so bear with me. It's basically from the old germ cell transmit heritable information concept. So we've never sort of updated the name. So because you have germ cells, pollen, egg, we call it germplasm. So nowadays, more important than anything else is not just the plants themselves, but the actual DNA, because we do have the ability to send plants around the world, and they don't care about living tissue. They want DNA. They want to understand it from a molecular point of view. And so we conserve seed, we conserve living plants, we conserve cell lines, we conserve sequence data. Not all at the Arboretum, but that's what we do in the USDA. And it's called ex situ conservation, which means we've taken it out of its situation, we've taken it out of place, and we're now conserving it in a garden or a facility. And for those that are interested in that, it's a rare hybrid that occurs in cultivation. So of buckeye, you guys probably know buckeyes. And so why is this? What's some of the stories perhaps? So this is an interesting one to me. This is called Farge or Farge's filbert, horrible name, but you can't call it Chinese filbert or Chinese hazelnut because there's actually a Corylus chinensis. And so we're stuck with this. He was a French missionary in Western China. So anyways, unknown to science, unknown to Western science until 1996 and 1998 when a consortium of gardens around the country, which includes us, it's called NACPEC, but we work with about 10 other institutions, collected it in the field. And it's a really fascinating story we don't have time to bring, but we actually got it into the United States and then realized that the original trees had this incredible bark like a river birch or a paper birch. It just exfoliated and it was like, oh my God, like this doesn't exist in the world of Corylus. And Corylus is actually, the genus filbert is actually a pretty good street tree. Corylus coryluna, I don't know if the Turkish filbert is grown here. But if you wanted that plant as a nurseryman or as a gardener or anyone, you can figure out where it is. This is our Germplasm Resource Information Network. And you go in there and you click on the website and you select the database and you select plants. But if you're into cattle breeding or poultry breeding, you would look at what you have in the animals. And if you're into beer making, you might go to plants or microbia. Well, why would you go to microbia? Because the United States has one of the largest yeast collections in the world. You might want to safeguard yeast. It's pretty important. Between bread and beer, you want to make sure you have those strains. And so we have all of that. Anything that's important to our economy and American agriculture, we try to conserve. At the National Arboretum, our focus is ornamentals, which is great. So, and then you do a search. Okay, you type in a scientific name, get a list. Now ignore this thing that says it's unavailable because there's a glitch. And then we can highlight one, which was listed on that label. That plant was actually at the Arnold Arboretum. And then you can click on it, you can put it in your shopping cart. First of all, it tells you where it was found, where it was collected, and whether it's available. But you put it in your shopping cart. Literally, you put it in your shopping cart on the website. And then we get an email when you're done that says, Dale Skaggs at Dixon would like scion wood of this Corylus, or a division of this hosta, or seed of this maple. That's what we do. We do this for free. We ship around the world free material, and that has been codified since the early 1800s to distribute this material. So all of this is available. So as a garden, we don't do this for homeowners, so please don't be mistaken. This is not for you to shop. This is for industry and nurserymen or other gardens, and you can request it. Now what we really like is for you to come visit. So we want Dale to come visit, and then we load him up with live plants out of the greenhouses, and then we go, because that's what we do. And then it shows up in a garden, and someone reads a label that says, where's this plant came from? My God, there's a National Arboretum? I've heard that today, or this week, right? My God, what do they do? I got to find out more. So this is a real accession label is what I meant when we talk about this in the lineage. Now that's what we do. So again, to come back to this sort of concept here, Great American Landscape. Actually, this is a great American landscape because most landscapes don't have that many plants. This is in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, outside of Scott Arboretum. This is a house, hopefully influenced by the tremendous collection at Scott Arboretum. But those aren't just trees in that landscape. There are some green meatballs and hostas, but I want to focus on the trees. That in this beautiful entrance to an all-American home, you have this. This is the Ben Franklin tree. So Franklinia alatmaha, and this plant has a storied history in the United States, but in short, it doesn't exist in the wild anymore. Last time it was seen in the early 1800s. It was collected by some of the early botanists, like Bartram was involved in the collection of this and documentation. But it's amazing. It's in the tea family, the camellia family, flowers in the summer, notoriously finicky, which is probably why it's dead in the wild. I think we just got it right before it got snuffed out. It wasn't some, conspiracy or anything, but, plants do die out, things die out. Great fall color, but again, you can have both, aesthetics and conservation and value. Some plants never make it. This is probably because it's called false poison sumac, but it is false. It is not a poison sumac. It is also known as Michaud's sumac. It is sumac, federally endangered, occurs only in a few areas in Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And half of the known population since I've been in school have been extirpated, which means they do not exist. They have been lost to development or invasive species or other things. So in my lifetime as a horticulturist, 50% of this population is gone, which is unfortunate because it only gets about 18, 20 inches tall, has beautiful orange fall color, federally endangered, which probably keeps it from being cultivated at times, but really is beautiful. And I got into plants, botany and naturalists because of people like this. André Michaud is one of the great French naturalists. He was one of those folks botanizing in the late 1700s, early 1800s. His father as well, or his son. I get confused who was father, who was son. But they explored this great wealth of plant diversity in the United States that we had. And this was 1795, and this is today. So that is what has happened to plants in the southeastern United States and actually the world. So, and I'm getting to a point here, so bear with me. So, and this is when I moved to Washington, D.C. during the housing, right before the housing bubble, 2008, 2009. This is what was going on in Northern Virginia or Maryland, right? These were all the new developments being put in. And so this is actually my take-home message here in the data slide, but I just want you to focus on this concept of domesticated nature. So the quote says, if anthropogenic change, i.e. humans, decreases diversity, it will likely do so in a non-random way as specific species are encouraged or eliminated by human action. Well, what does that mean? It means we're making choices as to what stays and what goes. And so the red line on that graph is a species that over time has declined, loss of habitat, invasive pathogen. And then the other species respond in an ecosystem because they're connected. And what we know is that these reverberations go on into time. And so you can see some recover and some don't because we have to start thinking from an ecosystem approach. And so the follow-up quote here is, our challenge is to understand and thoughtfully manage the trade-offs among ecosystem services that result from inescapable domestication of nature. So this was written by a collection of scientists around the world, from worldwide, including nonprofits like World Wildlife Fund and other partners that said, this idea of a pristine environment, you need to forget about it. You can find plastic bags in the deepest oceans, and you can find pollutants in Antarctic ice cores. Microplastics, you probably have a pound in all of you, right? So this idea we have to come to grips with is we have domesticated the planet, we have domesticated nature, and therefore it's up to us what stays or goes. We have to make some hard decisions because we can't save it all. So now that sounds depressing, but it's kind of like the first thing you have to do is acknowledge you have a problem. And so how are we going to do this? And Phipps Conservatory in Pittsburgh, and this is the Center for Sustainable Landscapes, is sort of what you see in landscapes now in this day, right? This new approach to ecosystems. And the great, beautiful thing about this is the number of plants that are used in these landscapes. So And we talk about reverberations, and hopefully this is kind of cool for some of you that transcend gardens and art and horticulture or birds, if there's any birders here. So this is Mark Catesby's image of a passenger pigeon on a turkey oak, which is a species in the sandhills in the southern United States. And so Catesby was the first Audubon. So before there was Audubon, there was Mark Catesby. And he means a lot to me because he collected some plants that I worked on. But again, passenger pigeon. I know none of you have seen a passenger pigeon. But he liked to sort of paint them with the things that they were associated with. And these small acorns in these red oak groups were really important. Just like you have here, right? So you have, I've seen this in the gardens, in the streets here, cherry bark oak, Quercus pagoda. You probably maybe even take it for granted because it's in your backyard, it's native, who cares? Well, this is an example of reverberations. Those are the type of acorns that the passenger pigeon flocks would move around the country to eat. And so this preponderance for red oaks and landscapes over white oaks is actually not the way it was when the passenger pigeons were here. White oaks predominated. So they would eat this, willow oak, water oak, and then move north to the pin oaks. And so the passenger pigeons were following the masting of these small acorns, right? And so there's a story there in your collections. Imagine telling that story, that this was a food for passenger pigeon. At the same time, if you have an oak collection, and you can grow a lot of oaks here, you could grow this, federally endangered maple leaf oak. This is right across the river from you, well not quite, it's in the Ouachita Mountains in Arkansas, about 4 populations, federally endangered. But it's a really cool ornamental oak. We actually have some, like we can send it to Dale or Memphis today because we have worked with partners to collect it legally and properly, and then we have it documented and we can distribute it. So I tell you that because this is the Arnold Arboretum, one of the greatest arboretum on the planet. They're in Boston, and they're essentially a park. I dare say a 4-letter word. We get called a park, but we're an arboretum. But it's not mutually exclusive. You can picnic here, you can walk here, you can enjoy this here, but this is part of the multi-site national oak collection in the United States, which we are also a part of. It's not mutually exclusive. You need oaks, you need trees. Well, go get good stuff. Don't get random stuff or the same old stuff. 25% of your new installation should be something new, right? Something you don't know, because you can live if some of that fails. Don't do 100%. No one wants to do that. But think about that. There's layers here that resonates with everybody depending on when they come. So again, I don't know, 11:41. When am I supposed to stop?
You're good.
Okay. All right. So again, more art, and so here we are. John James Audubon, right? These are Carolina parakeets, which is cool to me because I'm a Carolina boy, and they're actually eating a burr, cocklebur, which was a primary seed source, which is interesting because it's a pretty bad agricultural weed now. Interesting you don't have Carolina parakeets eating a cocklebur. They also ate this fleshy fruited fruit, not like it wasn't Phoebe, but it was closely related. This is red bay. This is in the same family. So these are now under attack by laurel wilt, an introduction from an ambrosia beetle that brought in a fungus as well and is now killing members of the Lauraceae across the southern United States. Why is it important for Florida? Avocado is in the Lauraceae. So what did the USDA do? We repropagated all of the avocado germplasm from Miami and sent it to Hawaii on the off chance that it never gets to Hawaii to back up that collection. Unfortunately, our coastal hammocks, important migratory fruit and evergreen in those habitats is suffering from laurel wilt introduction. Even our regular old sassafras. Now what is this? Oh my gosh, root beer, filet, syphilis, and sassafras. If I haven't gotten your attention yet, I don't know what will. So those are all things associated with sassafras. Common sassafras, what we have overlooked in the United States as ornamental. Not so overlooked, but it is a bear to propagate. The birds eat the seed so fast you can't get it. It doesn't like to do cuttings or divisions. So it's actually difficult. And if it's difficult, the nursery industry tends to say, why bother? And if no one's going to buy it, that's a double whammy. So you have to work with these species. We have a lab in Tennessee where we're trying to look at some of these natives that are under threat and maybe have production issues, and how can we bring them to market. But just for FYI, Jamestown colony, one of the primary reasons it settled in Virginia after reports of the Roanoke colony was the great amount of sassafras. And the reason was syphilis was a big deal in England, and they had a quota. So Jamestown had to send a quota of sassafras leaves because a tea concoction was supposedly a syphilis treatment, or it was a syphilis treatment. Tell that to the high school kids that come into your garden if you want to teach things, right? So as an educator originally, how do you connect with people? Is it root beer? Is it gumbo filet, which is the source of it? Or is it syphilis, unfortunately? So same thing here. So we can do this. This is an overlooked plant that's federally endangered. This is stinking cedar or Florida nutmeg. So I was just over the sensory garden at Memphis, and I thought, what if we did this? The foliage reeks. Oh my gosh, if you crush it. It's also prickly. So you want a sensory experience, touch stinking cedar. It's also called Florida nutmeg because although it is have to be careful here, it's a gymnosperm, not a conifer. It's a gymnosperm. It's related to yews. You can see where it sort of looks like the mace around nutmeg. So, but the population is basically non-reproductive. It's a small population in Apalachicola, the panhandle of Florida. This is the first time I ever got to see it in the wild, suffering from an introduced fungus, or a fungus that they haven't quite figured out yet. Dan Hinckley, one of the world's great plant explorers, this is the first time he ever saw it. So he'd been on Himalayan mountaintops or South African fynbos, but he had never seen this. So this was a wonderful day. This is a national champion, and it's in Norlina, North Carolina. How the hell did this tree get to Norlina? Well, because when it was discovered in the 1850s, it was discovered late in Florida, it became all the rage. This was at a state representative's house, former house in historic house in North Carolina, and it was being passed around by, just like Franklinia was or Osage orange was by Jefferson and Washington. People in the South were passing around this incredible tree, and so that would fit in sort of storytelling as well. And you get to participate in its conservation. Species like this, species like Franklinia, are what we call conservation species. They only exist because we choose to conserve them. The moment we stop, they disappear. Franklinia has never been successfully reintroduced to the wild. This will never be introduced to the wild successfully either. It's a glacial refugia down there. It's a long story, but we can talk over lunch. So, Chinese plants, we talk about the same thing. This is cool because it's related to our bald cypress, but this is Chinese water cypress. And I really only mention this here because, again, I'm starting to feel old. I'm 47. I've been doing this 26 years, I guess, which is strange. But in my lifetime, this plant has gone to functionally extinct in China. That means the populations in China and Vietnam are no longer reproducing. It is used as a street tree in China, but it has now gone, again, in my lifetime, another species that is on the brink of extinction. Apparently, they just found a small population in Laos. But again, that's not going to really help matters too much. So again, this is what we're doing in our gardens. It's kind of unique. Paleobotanists love this. But again, not mutually exclusive. So I like to use this one because we are famous for our magnolia collection. We have a very historic magnolia collection. We're really sort of embracing it and redeveloping it. And so these are two young lovers, assumingly, picnicking in our magnolia grove underneath star magnolia. This is the pink form of star magnolia. Many of you know star magnolia is common in the landscape trade, maybe not so much the pink form. But what they don't know, and many of you may not know, is that it's also one of the rarest plants on the planet, technically, because it's only known from one population or two in Japan that's threatened. So here we have something that we already have, and there's a story right there that most people don't get. And so there's a need to conserve this material, and it's been used in breeding programs. And just real quick, magnolias in general, we think of southern magnolias, sweet bay magnolias, which are amazing. Some people said that southern magnolia was the greatest plant export ever from the United States. The English love it, the South Americans love it. I've seen it in Kunming street tree in Kunming, China. So, but magnolias are really cool. It's a primitive plant. Been around since the dinosaurs. Evolutionary wise, it's like the precursor, the dawn of angiosperms, higher plants. But this is the red list from the Botanical Garden Conservation International, which all gardens can join and be a member of. 245 species in the world, 131 of them are threatened with extinction. A plant that's been around that predated the dinosaurs, a genus, is now threatened with extinction. And what I'm showing here are the list of plants that are in cultivation as either ornamentals or possible ornamentals that we have in our collections, every single one of them. And what we have on down in the bottom is we don't even have data on some of these species in China. And I'm just showing you magnolia here from China, but how does that relate maybe to North America and what we're doing? And so this is Kevin Conrad collecting Ash's magnolia in the panhandle of Florida. How many know big leaf magnolia has the, North America's largest leaf? It's cool, tropical. Well, the ash magnolia, it's either a species or a subspecies of that. Huge flowers like this, can flower when it's just 18 inches tall, is restricted to the panhandle of Florida. So we're like, well, this is great. This is our panda. We're going to go in there. We're going to show how to conserve this and lead the way. And so for many years we've been collecting and working. And so to do this, and what you see on the left is just simply genetic data, kind of like a family tree. So you don't need to memorize anything here. But we went out and sampled more than a dozen populations to figure out what is in exists and then what exists in cultivation. And it turns out we actually found 2 populations that were unknown and not in cultivation. So we've now collected from that and we're now distributing that. So this is sort of the higher level genetic work that we do and germplasm work. But it's really amazing to then have that collection that you can talk about and it resonates. And so another example from the southeastern United States in magnolia, it's a little close to here, which is why I chose this one. But this is Magnolia pyramidata. Sorry, I forgot the common name on this one. But it's related to Fraser's magnolia, and it's a bad picture. But the point here is that we recognize that we didn't know much about this species. It's got a spotty distribution in the United States. And then we went to check, and we didn't even have any in the germplasm system. We had no collections of this. Incredible. This one was not even listed in ours, but it's from a nursery source. So we said, let's work with partners. Again, this is amazing because here's John J. Audubon with a yellow warbler. Of course, he was in Kentucky, but all over. And so here he is painting this, and we knew that this was a beautiful species, but my goodness, why for 200 years have we not done anything with it? So we said, well, let's do something about it. Let's figure out where it is and let's go collect it. And so we used our herbarium, which is like her library for pressed and preserved plants. This was actually the work of Dr. Todd Rounsaville in our germplasm program when he was a student. And so he was at the University of Kentucky. So you can see that little county down there, Fulton County. So this is, sorry, as close as I can get to Tennessee on this one, but hopefully it's close enough. So, but it does occur here. And so there it is. And so we used that to figure out where is it. Well, let's go back and find it. Well, he did that. It was supposed to be right here. And that's what the site looks like today. So some sort of shipping or cargo or something for the river there. So that population is gone. And so luckily we've found others in the United States and are collecting it. And so this is what we do. And so it's really heavy on germplasm, but hopefully you can see the connection with all the layers and stories. If you were wondering, this is dated. This is right during COVID. So the entire national plant germplasm system, more than 12,000 accessions. We have incredible, we have actually that's us, 12,000 accessions, 800,000 specimens in the herbarium. And then we distribute 337 accessions, 64 organizations, public, private, domestic, or foreign. It's all based on availability and it's free of charge. So I get about 1 cent, I think, of your taxes at the National Arboretum. So if you will double that for me, I would really appreciate it. It would double my budget. Don't tell people in DC I said that, but seriously. And so I like to show this one because who knew? This is a species of dogwood. Okay, good, thank you. I'm about done, and now you say, wow, it took, finally, we got it. So this is Cornus wilsoniana, Wilson's dogwood. And there was one plant that we know of at J.C. Rawson Arboretum. We were like, my God, why do we not know this? And it was named after and collected by E.H. Wilson, Chinese Wilson, one of the great plant collectors from Arnold Arboretum. Well, we know why it wasn't introduced, because those Boston people and Yankees want cold hardy stuff. And this was from southern China, and they didn't care about it, or it didn't live, right? And so this is a plant from the Nanjing area. I found it and brought about several hundred seed back, and it has been distributed. It's probably a zone 8 plant, zone 7B, but the bark is spectacular, unbelievable. The flowers are like the shrubby dogwoods. They're not the big bracts, big white things you're used to, but nonetheless a nice small to medium-sized tree. Would you grow that? All right. So, and then I had the pleasure of going to China and collect and participate. And so here we are in the Western Hills above Dali, which is a World UNESCO Heritage Site and biologically the most diverse places on the planet. And this is hemlock. So this is the Yunnan hemlock. So why are hemlocks a big deal? Well, because of hemlock woolly adelgid, which if you don't have it, I assume you will, maybe one day. But it's been devastating, the Canadian hemlock and Carolina hemlock on the eastern United States. So we've started a breeding program in the 1990s, and lo and behold, here we are. And we've introduced the first hybrid hemlocks that are tolerant to hemlock woolly adelgid. So if hemlocks are important, and maybe one day, imagine planting a hybrid hemlock that sort of allows you to have the hemlock, which is important to maybe Dixon, but it's also more sustainable, it's pest, and then there's a story of this conservation and long-term need. So we're introducing another one too this year. And so we're on to boxwood, which is, never thought I would say this, I love boxwood. So Dale and I are two people on the planet that love boxwood among a dozen. No. No, but boxwood is amazing because it was a $120 million crop in the United States. It was 120 million. To put that in perspective, all of the urban trees sold in the United States was about 400 million. So boxwood alone was a $120 million crop. It's lost about 20–30% of that value because of boxwood blight. And we've been carrying this along since we came over on the ships. And so this is Powell's Castle, this white Anglo-Saxon Protestant gardening heritage. This is what you see, right? So this is a great garden, and my friend's garden who recently passed away, unfortunately. So this is English box, one of the earliest plants that came over with the colonists. This is the Ratcliffe Estate in Maryland on the eastern shore. That's the old planting that would have been the walk down to the river, which is how your houses were oriented in the 1700s, was the river trade. And those plants have been there since the 1750s. But now it's also one of the most susceptible to boxwood blight. So what are we doing with it? Here's a row of boxwood blight. Luckily, it hasn't showed up to be a problem here. We just got it at the Arboretum. We're managing it. And so we're still learning. Everyone is still learning. We're doing a lot of research on this. But this is where we kick into high gear at the National Arboretum because we have the National Boxwood Collection. It was one of the first collections designated such in the 1990s. It's now called the Plant Collections Network. And so we have one of the most extensive boxwood collections in the United States, if not the world. And you combine that with Blandy Experimental Farm in Virginia, and we pretty much got most of it covered for what you can grow. And so we kicked into high gear and said, this is why we exist. We're going to get in and we're going to do research. We're going to understand the collection. We're going to understand how the pathogen works. We're going to breed new boxwood. It will be a new day for boxwood in the United States. And I show you that again because we have more than 350 accessions of boxwood. Who knew there was that many box? But we need to figure out, because they all start to look like green meatballs after a while, to be honest. So we deployed our genetic technology and fingerprinted them and said who's related to who, what do we really need, and where's the resistance lie? And so then we take that data, and this is Lynn Batdorf leaning over the table, who is a long-term curator of boxwood in the National Arboretum, wrote the encyclopedia, has retired, but we still work with him. Then we go out in our collection, make sure we understand what it means, and make sure that everything is properly labeled. And then we use it for breeding. And so this was our first crosses when I was still a scientist. This is Vader Valley. This is an Anderson collection that was introduced from seed in the 1920s, 30s, something like that, and via the Arnold Arboretum as the original plant. But it turns out that it's an amazing parent for what we want to do for resistance and cold hardy. And now we've got this whole generation of boxwood coming up that we're going to be evaluating over time. It takes a while, so hang in there. But we were able to do that because we had the plant records, the labels. We combined that with our science, which I know not everyone can do, but we got plants from gardens all over the United States. So this isn't just us. So I can go to Dixon's inventory, or I can go to Arnold Arboretum's inventory and say, hey, do you have this clone? I'm looking for this. It doesn't exist anywhere else, but it could be important. And then they're like, yeah, we'll send you cuttings. So we're all in this together. Every garden has a role. No one garden can do it all. And so you have these multi-sites. And again, when you get to talk about your boxwood, you get to talk about the story of the boxwood legends. And so these are names that really resonate. And it was so great to see John Baldwin used to such effect here in Dixon. That's one of my favorites. And you see here it's labeled Buxus microphylla John Baldwin. That's because for years we thought it was one of the Asian species. Well, in our DNA analysis, it turns out it's not. It's one of the earliest known hybrids between Buxus sempervirens and Buxus microphylla. Well, who cares? Well, I do as a breeder because I'm halfway to the next generation already just by using that plant. And it's a great plant, by the way. There's one of the original plants. Baldwin was a professor at the College of William and Mary. And so, again, I stress this because I was thinking about this last night. Every garden has a different model on how they exist. It may be earned income. It may be purely display. It may be some other thing. It may be us at the end of the spectrum, which is real heavy on research. But again, none of this is mutually exclusive, and you can actually, if you step back and understood potentially who your stakeholders are, they're not just the people walking through the gates or paying memberships. It's the professional societies and industry in your area. So you get to be that reference collection. So you get to come in and see how does this boxwood perform in Memphis? What boxwood should I be growing in my nursery? Well, let's go see Memphis. Let's go see Dixon. And then you start bringing in those people. And so it's not like a huge market per se for your membership, but to have them on your side as partners, as stakeholders, is really important. And I wouldn't forget that. If you're just focused on gates and bringing in visitors, you're going to really alienate the people that make what you do possible by growing the plants in the first place, and the gardeners that really rally the support and the energy. So that was Paul Saunders of Saunders Nursery in Virginia, the boxwood producer extraordinaire. Unfortunately, he recently passed away in the last couple of years. He was a great gentleman, and the Boxwood Society was meeting at the National Arboretum. He's pointing out D-Runk, which is a great, I don't know, do you have D-Runk? Do you use D-Runk? It's a great one. So we're almost done, bear with me. We're back to the Garden Club of America's circle and this notion of, after I told you all that, I'm still talking about this. This is our collection. It's not a greenhouse, it's not a nursery, it's a garden. All of that is possible with those layers and those stories and who you resonate to. So in this circle, again, one of the things that really led to something that was really important for us at the National Arboretum that put us on the map was a plant like this. This is Lucian Snow tea camellia. This is Camellia oleifera. So if you ever had tea oil, which is an incredible cooking oil in Asia and Japan, it's better than olive oil. This is where it comes from. They press the seeds. Well, it turns out that was part of the planting that we did after the Garden Club of America donated 100 or 200 camellias. We included this, although it came from our plant introduction, that formed the core of our camellia collection. And then over 7 decades, it got hammered by freezes and decimated the camellias, which sounds horrible. Well, this survived. And it survived along with this one, which was also planted at the same time. Worst name on the planet, Variety Z, Japanese camellia. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it was part of the gift, 1950s, and when we planted it. It survived. So Camellia japonica survived negative Fahrenheit in Washington, D.C. It probably root sprouted, to be honest, but nonetheless, all the others were killed. Well, those 2 plants, which were the gift of the Garden Club of America, and part of that initiation, is what gave inspiration to Dr. Ackerman at the National Arboretum to say, let's breed better camellias. Let's breed cold hardy camellias. Let's look at the silver lining of this devastating freeze and say, these survived. Let's make the next generation. And so that's what he did. So many of you may be familiar with a lot of the Ackerman series and these winter series, which are all National Arboretum introductions, all possible because we had an incredible collection with pedigrees and lineage and maps. We knew what they were, and then led to some pretty significant advances for the nursery industry. And so I'm going to end there. These are my children when they were younger. And this is the National Arboretum. And they don't care one bit what that species is. You all probably know what it is from around here. Osage orange, right? Yeah. So they're just having a good time. And that is the bulk of your visitors. They're here to have a good time. But hopefully you can connect to a number of them. And again, it's not mutually exclusive. The joy and wonders and beauty of the plants is not mutually exclusive from their botanical value and their scientific value and their societal value, because we need everything we can moving forward in the 21st century. And So thank you for having me, and hopefully that resonates. So thank you. Sure. Anybody have any questions or anything, or did I just, your minds are blown and you just want Elvis back? All right. Well, great. Well, thank you. I've had a great time. Met many of you. There's a question. Yes, Steve?
Any particular senators or congressmen or other groups to whom we could address support as individuals or as the Memphis Garden Club or
Right.
Dixon or whomever?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I will say this because I'm being recorded. As a federal employee, executive branch, I am not allowed to lobby Congress. However, if you would like to, I can help. So it's a good question. And all politics is local, and that's what we have a problem with in Washington, D.C. We're in D.C. You're taken care of. We actually don't even have representation. So if you go to a congressman's office in Tennessee, like if I did, and said, well, that sounds like a local problem, you should see your representative. Well, sorry, we have a non-voting member of Congress. And so it really, your question is, a national push is what would be necessary and get some attention in terms of why it's important for Tennessee. And the message for Tennessee would be, the nursery industry is a huge part of agriculture in Tennessee, and that we support Tennessee directly through McMinnville Research Station. And so that's the way you can couch it. Now, specifically who? We used to have a champion called Congressman Freelandhauser from New Jersey. And again, this isn't about politics, but this is reality. He was a moderate Republican that was being primaried out. And so he said, I'm done. He had health issues. He was a wonderful guy. He supported the Arboretum for 20 years. But when he finished, he happened to be the chair of the House Ag Appropriations Committee. This is where you want to be, right? Some sort of appropriations committee. So he gave us a $2.1 million increase in our budget. It was the largest increase in our budget since 1972. Which is sad to say that in 2018 it was the largest increase in our budget since 1972. So we don't actually have a lot of champions anymore because, and again, maybe you should cut off the mic. The model for pork, a lot of our stakeholders were set up for influence on the Hill or whatnot. And so when the pork model went away, our stakeholders had to restructure. And so turn into more philanthropic organizations. And so that's one thing that's never quite recovered yet. And so I would love to identify some, and I think the best way would, through Garden Club of America and industry, American Hort, our industry in DC, is to go to those states where you think of agriculture, but in some states, North Carolina is a good example, depending on the year and the housing starts. Because so much of landscaping was dependent on housing starts. You got to plant the green meatballs and the lawn and the turf. It was the largest segment of agriculture. It would vie with sweet potatoes. Now that would blow a farmer's mind to think that something was larger than sweet potatoes or whatever the crop is in your state. But for many states, ornamental horticulture combined is actually one of the largest forms of agriculture. And I think that message has been lost on a lot of people. And Tennessee certainly is historically still is an incredible nursery state. So is Oregon, North Carolina, even Florida, which is like the black hole of horticulture, to be honest. But that's another conversation. No, I shouldn't say that. It's great, but so anyways, it's a good question. I wish I could answer it, but I sort of stay out of that arena as much as possible.
Well, I hate to continue this, not hate to. I'd like to. If you could help give us a message. I'm not a scientist. If you could give us a message, we might know the people that we could send the message to.
Right. Yep. No, that can be.
If you could make it crisp and don't use Latin words.
No, that's not a problem. Yeah. So one time we used to have a dinner up there in D.C. and with our stakeholders, I sat with Representative David Price from North Carolina because he was in my district as a kid, and so I was director at the time, and the chief of staff is there, and we're talking, and of course the congressmen are milling about. And the chief of staff honestly said, I don't know why we're here. You know, like, why are we here at the National Arboretum? Why? They were very confused. They were honoring, we used to honor the states, so we were honoring North Carolina, so they got that part. But they were like, well, why do we really care? And so I went to them and said, do you realize that in North Carolina, ornamental horticulture is either number 1 or number 2 form of agriculture? And he gave me a card and said, you should talk to David. Like, why should I talk to David, who's been a representative for 2 decades, about something I assumed he knew that they would know? So that was mind-blowing to me. And I think a lot of people there's just so much going on, you know, it's hard to do everything. And so, yeah, we can, with the Friends of the National Arboretum and the garden, I didn't mention maybe that as part of the Garden Club of America, I was inducted as an honorary in 2019 up in Boston, all through the efforts of the Perennial Garden Club and Spring Valley Garden Club in Baltimore and Washington. And so there is nothing like 17,000, mostly women, in Capitol Hill to get some attention. So it's a pretty amazing group. So I mean that. I'm not just saying that. It's pretty amazing. But no, thank you. We can definitely work on that.
Are you doing anything with reestablishing American chestnut?
Yeah, right. Yeah, great question. So are we reestablishing chestnut or involved? Answer is no. The American Chestnut Foundation has really been driving that for 5-6 decades. In the earliest days, USDA was heavily involved. In fact, Frank Meyer was the collector that went to Japan that collected the bark samples from orchards in Japan and China that identified the disease first and where it came from. So the USDA was involved 100 years ago in that. And then we started doing some breeding. And then the Forest Service said, stop breeding in agriculture. It's a forestry crop. And we're like, well, it's also a nut crop. Well, long story short, to me, I use this as a great failure of a federal government. And it sounds horrible up here as an executive, or as a member of the government, but we exist to do long-term high-risk research. And we gave up. We kind of did. We just said, it's not going to happen. And so think about a nonprofit having to carry the load for restoring a great American icon. It's a really tragedy, actually, to think of. So you're saying, well, do something about it, Dr. Olsen. Well, it's not in my portfolio from Congress to touch it. But we have trees. We work with folks to do that. And so we'll do our darndest to advocate and support it. It's a great, amazing plant, but we don't have our hands in it. Other than collecting species of chestnut from China and Asia in the last 20 years to augment those programs, but directly, no, we're not doing anything.
Who was the painter you mentioned before Audubon?
Mark Catesby.
Catesby?
Yep, Catesby. So he was based out of Charleston, essentially, back in the day when Charleston was a huge port. This is the 1720s, and so they were going from Charleston to the low country, well, the back country is what they called it, but what they were really doing was they were staying above the swamps of Georgia, going to Mobile area and the Creek Confederation. So the Creek was such a large trading partner, people don't realize that's where they were going. So on his way, when these were being opened up, when England and Spanish were out, long story, he botanized throughout those areas of Georgia and Alabama. So yeah, Mark Catesby.
Thank you.
Yep.
How large in acreage is the arboretum?
It's actually 451 acres and 1.1% of Washington, D.C. So, yeah, it's in northeast Washington, D.C., about 2 miles from the Capitol.
Can you take a tour?
Yeah, so we have to schedule tours. We do have a tram, but it's not, you can't just show up and do it. So we do have 9.5 miles of roads, 4 bridges. And I was telling Dale and others, I feel more like a facilities manager than a botanist these days. But so yeah, it's a pretty amazing place. We have 765,000 visitors a year. Most of our peak season is in the spring between March and May, Mother's Day. And then we have a shoulder season in the fall. And we have fall color through, I always say, through Veterans Day. So it's an amazing place to see fall color. Something like 20 collections. I mean, I didn't get into all the details of the Arboretum, but all right. Is that good? Thank you.